I love operating systems. In fact, I'm a collector of operating systems. Would you like to see my collection? Well, you sure can. Take a look right here on my system. So for example, I'm a big fan of Ubuntu Linux. And if you look there, I've got all these different versions of Ubuntu, and some of them go way back. Over here, I've got copies of Windows 7 and 8 and 8.1. There's even a copy of Vista in there. And if you really want to see a mess, here's all my different versions of Windows 10. Now if you look at these, they just look like files stored on a server someplace. But what you're really looking at are what are called ISO images. An ISO image is a perfect copy of what was originally optical media. So the idea was, back in the old days, and still today, I've got a Windows 10 on DVD right here, is that you bought an operating system or acquired an operating system by purchasing or acquiring optical media. Optical media has been installing operating systems since before 1995, so that gives you an idea how long this has been around. Now, when you install an operating system onto a hard drive, what you're actually doing is a lot more than simply copying some files onto the drive. Remember, the operating system has to be in the partition tables, and it has to pick up once the system BIOS has said you're good to go. So the actual process of installing an operating system is, well, yeah, there's a lot of copying, sure, and a lot of setting up, but it also puts itself in the position on your hard drive's partition table so it can begin to load once your system BIOS is done. So we do a lot of installing stuff. So the trick here is that we use ISO images everywhere to do everything. If I want to make a bootable optical media, I have to get an ISO, and then I have to go through a process called burning it to put it on there. Now, the only downside to optical media, I wouldn't say it's a downside, but because it's becoming more uncommon, we're starting to see stuff like this. So here's a copy of Windows 10 Home. Nope, it's not a CD-ROM. It's actually just a little tiny thumb drive, and that's what I use to install now. On this thumb drive is an ISO image of exactly what's on here. It's just that thumb drives have become more common, less people have optical media, so that can be an issue. If I want to make bootable media, I have to get an ISO from somewhere, and then I take that ISO and burn it onto these different types of media. So we burn onto optical media, but actually the term even fades now into things like USB thumb drives, or if you want to use an SD card, almost any kind of media like that. We still tend to use the word burn, although it really only makes sense for optical media. So a couple of things I want to show you here. First of all, if you take a look at these are ISOs. Number one, Windows recognizes these as disk image files, but it doesn't show something that I have to actually turn on so you can see it. And what I'm going to do is unhide extensions for known file types. Now watch what happens when I do this. Do you see the ISO? Any file that ends with ISO, and notice how big they are. These are big, big, big files. So, because they're going to fill up either the equivalent of a CD or a DVD. I guess there's ISO for Blu-ray, but I've never actually used those. So anyway, there's a couple of cool things you can do with an ISO. First of all, in most operating systems, certainly Windows, if you want to see the contents of an ISO, you can go through the process of mounting it. I just right-click on it and select Mount. And this is what actually shows up if I were to go through the process of burning. These are the actual files that are set up ready to go so that it would install Windows for me. Now that's great, but I want to actually go through the burn process. Now Windows makes this fairly easy. I want to unmount this guy. We'll eject him. So I want to go ahead and burn one of these. Windows does make it pretty easy. So for example, these are my Ubuntu versions. I can pick an arbitrary version of Ubuntu, and Windows has burn disk image ready to go. Now, if you have an ISO, it will automatically, assuming you've got your optical media and it's a CD or a DVD and you got it plopped in there, it will make an actual installation disk from that ISO. So if I needed to install Ubuntu through optical media, This is how I would do it, setting it up in Windows. That happens a lot. Ubuntu has all the same features. All versions of Linux have the same features. So it's actually pretty trivial to make bootable media when you have optical stuff, because every operating system has something built into it, as long as you have the ISO. Speaking of ISOs, let me show you something. Right now, I'm on the Ubuntu website, and I want to download a copy of Ubuntu. So when I click on this, I'm going to actually, I've already done this, so I want you to look in the lower left-hand corner. It downloads, do you see what that is? It's an ISO file. All versions of Linux, all distros, if you want that version, you go to their website, you download the ISO that you're interested in. You can even download in Microsoft Windows. Windows will let you download an ISO of Windows 10. You can make your own bootable media, but when you install, you better have a CD key, otherwise it won't completely work. So it's easy to get ISOs. Making them for optical media is easy. Now, what I want to do now, though, it's even more fun, is this time I want to make some ISOs and I want to put it on a thumb drive. So I've got a thumb drive plugged into my system right now. And in this case, we're going to have to use some type of tool. The tool I know and love is called Rufus. So here's good old Rufus. Rufus is totally free, it's extremely well known, and it is a great tool when you want to burn an ISO onto a thumb drive. So right now, it sees my one thumb drive right there. So it's a 2 gigabit thumb drive. And it's saying, what do you want to boot from? And I'm going to say, well, I want an ISO image. So I'm going to select an ISO image. Now, in this particular case, I have a copy of the popular Linux Mint, which is a nice distribution a lot of people like to use, sitting on my desktop there. So I'm going to select that. And what it's going to do is it's going to take this ISO and it's going to turn my thumb drive into a perfectly bootable little thumb drive, just like the Windows ones there. So I'm going to just go ahead and hit the start. It even has some little options in here. It's like, oh, now wait a minute, this particular version of Linux that you're trying to make an ISO needs a particular file. Do you want me to go up online and download it for you? And it just does it automatically. And here you take a look, it says write in ISO image mode, which is the common way. Linux also has something called DD, which we talk about in other episodes, but we're going to just do ISO. Warning, warning, you're going to lose it all. And it's going to go ahead and make an ISO image. Now, once I've got that, I now have a thumb drive, and we'll say it's a bootable thumb drive. And I can put that onto a new system, for example, with the hard drive that's completely blank, as long as I set my boot order. That's what always gets us in trouble here. Get your boot order so you're booting to that thumb drive, and it will automatically go, hello, I'm Linux Mint, would you like me to install on the hard drive? And you just go. It's really that easy and does an absolutely great job. These tools also work with, for example, Rufus works perfectly. You got an SD and you want to boot to that? As long as you have a boot order in your BIOS. A lot of BIOSes won't let you boot to flash media, but if it does, you can go ahead, Rufus, you plug this in, burn it, make yourself a nice bootable SD. Almost anything works. In fact, people who use Raspberry Pis, for example, they don't have hard drives in their little computers. They just have little SD cards. So it's very common to download what they call the Raspbian distribution, and they use Rufus to go ahead and make a little tiny, it's a micro SD, but they make it bootable. They put it in through their Raspberry Pis and it just boots up. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, there are other ways to boot. One other way to boot I want to make sure you're aware of is over a network. There are two big options when it comes to booting over a network. There's the universal, what's called PXE booting, and then there's also Apple's NetBoot. Now, these type of boot functions require you to get into your system setup, and you'll say, look, I don't want to boot from my hard drive or a thumb drive or anything. I want to boot on from the network. And depending on your solution, you often just type in a network address and you hit enter, and it will automatically boot from a properly configured server somewhere else on your network. Now, luckily for us, we don't have to go into server configuration in A+, talk to me in Network+, but you can actually boot from a network itself. This is very popular for what we call diskless workstations or thin clients, where we don't even bother putting in a hard drive. It just does a PXE boot, and all of a sudden you're in Windows, and you're like, wow, that's cool. All right, now there is one other way to boot. This is kind of unique to Windows, and I want to make sure you're aware of this. Built into every copy of Windows is the ability to basically make your own installation disk. You don't even have to get an ISO or anything. The reason behind this is because Windows, if you've got a big problem, they want you to be able to put in a disk, boot to it, and the Windows, it's really a copy of the Windows installation disk, that it will boot up and it will go and go, hey, wait a minute, I see there's a copy of Windows already installed on your hard drive. Would you like me to fix it? And it's called the Windows Recovery Environment, or WinRE. Let me show you how to make one of those. Now, first of all, you're going to have a thumb drive. And this is in the control panel, and all we do is create a recovery drive. And it'll say, what do you want to put in there? I always want to back up all my system files as well. You usually need about a 16 gigabyte thumb drive to make these guys work. So make sure you have a nice big drive. This is going to take a while. I'm just going to let it run. It's going to go and say, oh, I see you have a thumb drive. Do you want me to put it there? And you go, yes. From then on, anytime you're working with a Mike Myers system, you're always going to notice a thumb drive that's taped up on the monitor. It's because I've made a recovery drive. If I ever have a problem with this system, I'm not fumbling around looking for my original installation media. I've got my own little thumb drive. It's ready to go to save me in case something goes wrong.